What's up, you guys? This is Devin with Century Effects Studios, back with another video, and today we're going to be talking about light meters. And a lot of people don't know what light meters are. Light meters are essentially what they say they are. They are devices that tell you how much power of light you're getting in a certain spot. Now that's extremely important because cameras can't do that. Cameras use what we call reflective light meters in their systems. It's just taking in an average of what's coming in from the subject or what's bouncing off your subject. Now these are what you call incident light meters. It can measure what's coming off the subject and measure what's coming into it at a certain spot. Now you have to understand that having light meters that can record in a certain spot is extremely important. Now your camera might say that it has a spot meter, but it still records reflected light off of your subject. Now it can try its best to get a certain spot, but it's nowhere as accurate as a light meter. The way the light meter works is you tell it what shutter speed you're at, you tell it what ISO value you're at, and then it'll tell you what f-stop that you have to set your camera to get the desired exposure even and balanced like you want it to be. And usually you put it up near someone's face. Why? Because you want to get their face exposed. And you see, exposure is different in different areas. The background might be exposed differently, the foreground might be exposed differently, but the camera can't possibly in most situations account for all of that light. So what are you stuck with? You're stuck with the camera's meter, and in general cases it's okay. It's not perfect, but it's okay. It'll do the job. But what if you had maybe 3, 4, 5 flashes? Then that's something totally that the camera can't account for, because the camera doesn't know exactly everything that's going to happen. That means the camera's auto mode is null and void because it can't tell you exactly what's going on, because 5 different flashes all at that brief moment in time, you can barely even see it with your own eyes, let alone the camera being able to figure it out. So what you do is hold your light meter up. Now this light meter has 3 different modes. It has an ambient mode. It records for the ambient. So if I wanted to get a constant light like this one, it'll work for cinema and video. But at the same time, it can do what we call a non-corded mode and a corded mode. So it has this little mode button right here. You just hit non-corded. Once you hit the little trigger on the side, it'll be looking for a flash, and then once you flash, it'll give you a reading: F11, F5, F8, F5.6, F5.68, F609, whatever the reading might be. But you also have to understand that your camera can't do all of that. Your camera can't do ambient light accurately like this can. Your camera can't do more than 1 flash, if it can even do that 1 flash, let alone 5, 6 flashes. Because if you wanted to get very intelligent about your lighting design, you would have to rely on the camera, and you can't really do that if you're relying on auto mode in your camera. At the end of the day, yeah, you can take a picture and review it, but the more flashes you put in your shot, the worse off you might be. Now usually we go by our eye. We'll take a picture, look at the screen, oh, it's not right. Now usually with 1 light source, that might be fine. 2 light sources, you're pushing it just a little bit. 3 light sources, you probably can't tell where that 3rd light source is coming from. A lot of people use the technique of taking a picture, then adding a flash, taking a picture, oh, it's good, add another flash, take a picture, good, add another flash. But at the same time, you won't be able to get a lot of things done, and you tend to not look up light ratios and research light ratios that would help you. A lot of people use light ratios to help them to get these things in consistently. And a lot of people rely on Photoshop to get exposures corrected. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but too much exposure correction will have you on Photoshop a lot. And if you're a photographer, that might be time off things that you can't do otherwise. Especially now we're in coronavirus. We spend a lot of time trying to get business, let alone spending a lot of time that a lot of people trying not to pay for right now, because a lot of people not getting paid. So the last thing you want to do is not have a light meter. Now I say that I don't want to bite my tongue, but I say all of that, and I'm gonna let you know, be very transparent, that light meters are pretty expensive. But at some point in time in your photography career, I believe that you should have a light meter. Now, there are some other popular photographers on YouTube that say you should not have a light meter, and you do not need it in this day and age because you have auto meters here, there, and everywhere else. But like Carl Taylor says that he had meters at one point in time, and then he stopped using meters. Tony Northrup also said that light meters are not necessarily used utilized because you have all these different things on your camera that can help you understand it. But in my opinion, I feel like everybody should at least come into a contact with a meter and utilize it and actually like see exactly what it tells you for each exposure at least once, and then compare it to what your camera gives you. Because if you're used to seeing the difference, you're able to know what is politically correct from this computer and what is known as quote unquote the perfect exposure based off of what this computer says. And then you're able to see where your camera changes it, where your camera says middle gray is, and all these other exposure values are. And then you can make an intelligent, confident decision on what exposure is, because exposure is so hard. I know we have these new LCD screens, especially on the R5, but you have to understand that these screens don't give you as much of a readout as this meter will. It won't give you it won't tell you exactly everything you need to know, because it doesn't know everything that you want. The same thing with all the auto modes that you have. You can't get everything you want out of a camera because it has so much it has to account for. So it's good to have something that is designed to give you the right meter reading just by itself. What we call the correct exposure, as perfect as it possibly can be, which is middle gray or whatever the camera might see. And then there is creativity. So even if you want to, I don't know, raise the exposure a little bit more or make this exposure a little bit darker for a moodier look, you have a central grounding point that will keep you grounded and say, okay, this is right. If you go this way, you know what right is, instead of shooting blindly and trying to figure it out for years and years and years, and then figure out, oh my goodness, my exposure has been off for years and I didn't know that. Well, having an exposure meter will help you and guide you faster. Even if you get rid of the meter after a while, you at least had experience with it to actually give yourself a guiding principle of what most people think is the correct exposure. All right, now we're going to get into a video using these three ways: using a light meter, using just my eyes and what I feel the back of the screen might tell me, and then also using my camera's auto mode to expose for a scene. And we're going to see what the differences are.
So essentially how you use your meter is you put it in the correct mode. Right now we don't have a flash going, we're just going to use ambient mode. I set it to 1/25 of a second or 1/125 and ISO 100. And we're going to take a meter reading on Jada's face. So we're just going to bring this to her face, and we're going to point the light bulb back at the camera or wherever your camera might be. So right under her eye, and you just press that button, and it says 2.83, which means if we're at a shutter speed of 1/25, ISO 100, we need to be at an aperture of about 2.83, or for those of you who have cameras that measure in third of a stops, 2.8. We're actually going to be using the 5D Mark II with a 50mm 1.8, and we're going to set it to 2.8 and take a picture. So let's do that right now. Now we're setting this to manual mode, and we set this to manual mode, we're able to actually get the desired settings that we have on our meter. ISO 100, and we're going to go 2.8 and see exactly what results we get. Okay, that's looking pretty good, All right, it looks to be right. Now we're going to go into Lightroom and check that out. Now we're going to do the next thing, where I want to set my own exposure and see if everything is going to come out correctly. So screw the order that I gave you. All right. So what we're going to do is the next thing we're going to do is take an auto exposure reading with the camera and see exactly what the actual exposure is going to be. Okay, that's drastically different. All right. Now we're going to set it my way. How would I set this coming up in this scene with Jada, the model? What would be my preferred settings based off of what the camera's telling me when it's histogram and its central settings? All right, so I'm just going to do it based off of what I think. 5. Oh, that was bad. Let me try that again. Hold on. Oh, that's bad. Let me try that again. Oh, 2.5 at 1/25 of a second at 160 ISO. So that looks to be right, but I'm using my eyes to figure this out. And you might be saying, well, Devin, you can just set it to the right exposure with your meter and just do it that way. Yes, but we've gotten 3 drastically different settings or exposures, and they're drastically different pictures. And we don't necessarily know which one is the correct exposure. Based off of what I looked at, now, my whole personal me going through it and setting my own settings without the meter, that's assuming that I didn't have a meter in the first place, and I'm just pretty much setting the camera like I think it should be set, instead of actually having some kind of a central meter reading that actually is, you know, computer accurate. But we're about to go back into Lightroom and actually see what the camera has thought based off of what I thought, based off of what the meter thought. So stay tuned.
All right, guys, we're in Lightroom with Jada's pictures. Now we have 5 different pictures that we took. Remember, we took one with the meter. We took another one with the camera's auto exposure. Here's my failed attempt 1. Here's my failed attempt 2, and here's my attempt at 3. Now we're gonna start with the first one, which was the meter's reading. Now the meter's reading is pretty good, and you might be saying to yourself, why would you say that? It's a bit dark. That's not necessarily the point of the meter. The meter is to give you a happy medium based off of what it thinks middle gray is, but in the specific spot it calculated middle gray, and I used her eye as that determining factor. Now, of course, her eyes are going to be a little bit darker because it's metering for a middle gray. Now, if I were to scroll around this image, I would notice that her chest is a different exposure, then her neck is a different exposure, then her chin, which is a different exposure, then her forehead, and all these things are calculated when you're thinking about exposure holistically. Now, when you think about, in general, exposure, you have to understand that there's a whole bunch of different exposures just for one little object or subject or anything that you're taking pictures of. So the meter will meter off of that one specific spot. Now, whether or not you want to bump it up a little bit or bring it down a little bit, it's up to you. But when you're taking pictures and you're doing portraits, you have to understand that it's going to meter for middle gray, or it's going to meter for middle gray. And so eyes are going to come out a little bit gray, but that's not a bad thing, because when you underexpose a digital sensor, you have a lot more room in post to pull it up, especially if you're shooting raw. So you have this picture of Jada that was taken with the meter, and I think it's great. It's fine. It's totally fine for what we're doing. It gives me a starting point for where I am going to actually start taking my pictures. Now, the next image that you'll see is the auto mode from the 5D Mark II, which is this one right here. Now, as you can see, it did not handle this situation all too great. It wasn't bad. It wasn't bad, but it easily overshot some tones in the face, in my opinion. But taking in auto mode made us go to 1/50th of a second, 2.8 at 100 ISO, and it's just doing it at 1/50th of a second doesn't give us what was tuned into our meter, which was at 1/125th of a second. So the camera just took it up on itself to meter what it thought we were supposed to get, and therefore we got a slightly blurrier image than we got originally with the light meter. Now, this is a safer image. It's not as bright as the other one, but is a safer image. So if I wanted to make sure I got a satisfactory image that didn't have any, motion blur or anything like that, to compensate for the lack of exposure, sacrificing stability in my camera, then I'm not going to go with auto mode. I wouldn't go with this one. Even though a lot of things look to be well exposed, especially around there, I can see the hair a little bit more and then in the meter shot. But you have to understand that you weren't metering for just her eyes. You were actually metering for the entire scene. And the camera came up with a decent, happy middle ground, but I wouldn't use this because the highlights are just a little bright for my taste on her skin. Now, you might think otherwise. I'm not here to tell you you're right or wrong. I'm just giving you the results that I got. Now, here's my attempt at metering this with the first image here. I knew it was dark, and I tried it again. Okay, now it's bright. And now we got to about a happy medium. And compare that to right here. This is the camera's version, and then this is my version. I think I came a little bit closer to saving a lot of detail in the face than the camera did in this situation. It's subtle, but not only did I go back to 1/125th of a second, deleting a lot more of that camera shake, but I also was able to save a little bit more tones in the body here, and I think I came pretty darn close. Now, for those of you, you know, who's like, oh my goodness, you're gonna say a whole bunch of stuff in the comments. Nobody is perfect, and I don't expect any of you guys to be perfect, and I expect you guys pretty much deal with this every time. But the difference between my 3 attempts and the light meter is that the light meter, even though it's a little bit dark, I would accept that instead of me shooting and overshooting and then getting it correct here, because it took me a lot more time to do that myself. Now you might be saying, well, what did you do for this shoot? Well, I took the light meter, took a reading, and then I took the rest of the shoot myself. And then I was able to bring it back in RAW, but not everybody uses RAW. A lot of people use JPEG and they don't have this amount of movement in post. So you might want to be thinking to yourself, based off of your own situation, what do you want to use? Alright guys, I hope you liked that video. I hope you learned a little bit about light meters and their importance. I believe that you should use a meter. Other people might think differently, but I think you should at least come in contact with a meter, understanding what it is, how it does what it does. And then, especially if you're a multi-light photographer, it'll help you get a lot of jobs done if you're a pro faster than you would if you were just relying on the camera, because you would have to fix everything that you don't know in Photoshop. Now, it's easy for a pro to say that they don't need a light meter if they've already come in contact with it or if they've already used it. But if you've never used one before, you might not be thinking like a photographer might be thinking to get the most effective photo day, especially if you have a large photo day doing the exact same thing like corporate headshots. That's just something to think about. This is just what I think. And not everybody thinks the way I think. I understand that. But let me know what you think in the comments below, and stay tuned for the next video.